I not so recently delved into the dungeons of Elsword, first showing those that I thought brought a good experience, showed good effort, had a good result. I then pointed out those that seemingly had little effort or were pointless and redundant. Some of you wholeheartedly agreed with my choices. Some of you screamed like I was trying to remove your thumbs with pliers. But since I love the sound of those screams so much, let's go ahead and take a look at the top 7 bosses in Elsword. Sure, it's important dungeons themselves are good, but for every dungeon you complete, you also have to face a boss. And bosses typically require a level of uniqueness and creativity higher than that of dungeons. If a boss isn't unique, it just plays like a typical mob enemy that hits like a truck. But if it is unique and rewarding, a boss can be the best part of a dungeon. So there's more to discuss with bosses than with most dungeons. I'll be covering design, attacks, gimmicks, challenge, stage design, music, and any bugs or issues that the boss happens to have. This is a video game after all. Keep in mind that because I have terrible timing, this follows April's revamp, which made some changes to some of these bosses. I tried to cover the changes best I could, but surely in my haste, I missed some, so I apologize in advance. But without further ado, let's count our way down to the number 1 boss in Elsword. Number 7. The King Naysod. The King Naysod is one of the first bosses that truly made an impact on me. I discovered him in Hanir before ever running Altera Core, so his appearance and mechanics genuinely surprised me. All of the bosses prior to the King Naysod are pretty standard and don't offer many unique mechanics or challenges. This boss, at the end of Altera, is kind of the marker in the game where you realize, oh, it's on. It's so on. The King Naysod's design kind of goes without saying. He's massive and definitely looks like, well, a Naysod. He's obviously got quite a unique appearance, and his appearance is probably what you'd expect of a King of Machines. A large machine connected to everything. In fact, he reminds me a bit of the MCP from Tron, with his large metal room and his giant presence looking down upon you. In his attacks, the King Naysod is a bit weak and predictable after you've fought him once, but I still don't have any huge complaints about them. They're varied and fit his design well, everything from hand slaps to ground pounds. He also has a tendency to use elemental attacks, which can only be done if the corresponding element's core remains operational by the players. The King Naysod is kind of one big gimmick, and don't get me wrong, that's great. Bosses should have gimmicks. Instead of attacking him directly like most bosses, you instead have to attack 4 elemental cores while he summons Naysods after you. After they're all destroyed, he reveals his primary core, which must be damaged to harm him, for a short time before regenerating his elemental cores and repeating the sequence. Realistically, the King Naysod is not that hard to beat. He kills the occasional low-level player, but realistically he's not too difficult as he doesn't hit too hard and you can predict most of his moves. Like his appearance, the King Naysod stage is very fitting of his role. It looks very techy and meshes well with his appearance, as well as his motif, and the background and stage both go very well together. The stage is also very spacious and easy to navigate, so it's a pretty good battlefield. Personally, I used to love the King Naysod's music. I honestly find it very fitting of him, but it's been reused on so many other bosses that it's lost its charm, so it's kind of been relegated to meh in my opinion. I still enjoy hearing the theme whenever I fight him, but hearing it when I fight Chloe just makes me cringe. As for bugs, this stage and the King Naysod really don't have any worthy of mention. Sometimes the death animation bugs a bit, but that's not a huge deal. Overall, the King Naysod, while neat and impressive to the eye, is not very challenging, and his gimmick alone is not enough to compensate for that and the atrocities done to his music. Number 6. Victor. Victor is an interesting boss, to say the least. He's not exactly the most unique or complex boss, but he's one of the few that actually seems to have his own personality. Instead of his fight defining him as most bosses do, he defines himself as an actual character. And considering how small his role in the story actually is, this is a pretty impressive feat. His appearance is not remarkably stunning, but it is unique. He's a glitter. Yeah, you know, those annoying little guys you fought for like 325 dungeons already. But yet, he's on an entirely new level, being the largest and most detailed glitter to date. So why is he getting such a high score here? Because of how he acts. Yes, that's part of his design. The way he's introduced, the way he behaves, and the way he moves around the stage both during and after his cutscene define him as a boss that has a personality all his own, and that's worth something. While Victor doesn't have a lot of variety in his attacks, he has quite a few of them. They're basically physical attacks, ignoring his yell, though I guess sonar attacks are still kind of physical. Still, he has a pretty good variety of charging, punching, slamming, jumping, and so on. And, to top it all off, he's got a move called Showtime, which is an extension of his personality and really quite a flashy, hammy, unique move. Okay, so Victor doesn't really have any gimmicks. I don't really count Showtime as one because it's still a pretty conventional move, even if it is kind of unique and flashy. Victor can be a bit of a challenge, but he's pretty easy to avoid after a couple attempts. You can generally dodge behind him when he's punching, and his other attacks are sparse enough that they can be dodged pretty easily. Even Showtime, in all its glory, is a move predictable enough to dodge reliably. The stage here is okay, not great. It's quite a bit like Terran Vash's, minus the mirrors. It does have an added nicety of an intro phase where you get to fight mobs as you're lowered down to Victor's fight though, as well as a cutscene, which does give it a bit of added uniqueness. The theme that Victor gets loses points for not being unique at all, having been played for every single Hamel boss leading up to him. That said, it does fit nicely with Hamel, and even though this stage has a somewhat different feel, it still manages to fit here too. While it's not my favorite, nor the best theme in any way, I can't really dock it too much given how it fits here. Last, but not least, I cannot recall a time when Victor threw a bug my way. Maybe he's just so big that he can step on all the bugs before we encounter them. All in all, Victor is not the best boss fight, but I put him among the best bosses. He's unique in his own way and has a well-defined personality that shames most other bosses, even those on this list. Number 5. Avalanche. Despite my initially negative impression of this boss, Avalanche is a pretty neat enemy. His appearance is cool as ice. Boo. He fits his environment well without being a copy of, well, anything we've previously seen in the Icy world. Though not really a consideration in his ranking, he also has a pretty good story justification as well. Avalanche's design looks a bit standard at first, but I rather like it. The appearance of his skeletal body, priestly robes, and staff all make his design really cool and unique. I think I must be a sucker for his color scheme too, because that gold just looks awesome with the rest of it. Avalanche's attacks are pretty diverse and can't always be predicted. Particularly with his falling icicles and homing ice missiles, he provides a pretty unique attack method, even if it's pretty easy to pick up on and overcome. His melee moves are pretty standard though. But the coolest part is the fact that he has an ultimate attack, and while previously it was honestly quite rare, it's become far more frequent since the revamp. Avalanche fights in a pretty standard way, and the only gimmick he has I honestly find very annoying. After so much HP loss, he will retreat to the background where he cannot be hit and he launches missiles and icicles at you. Because unlike Magmanta, there's no strategy to even prevent this, it just gets really frustrating, sometimes even more so than on Magmanta. If there's going to be a gimmick in a fight, at least make it engaging or interesting instead of redundant and predictable. Avalanche didn't used to be that strong, but has become a really good challenge. That said, he's still pretty average compared to most of the other revamped bosses at his level. Most of his attacks are pretty easy to evade with a couple small exceptions. Just be careful of the ultimate attack because it hits hard. If you can't hide behind a rock in time, you're probably a goner. This stage is pretty cool. It's by no means perfect and it does mimic a lot of what you've already seen in the dungeon, but it fits the atmosphere perfectly and still doesn't feel totally recycled. Even the ascent up to this stage feels somewhat unique, so I really have no complaints about how Avalanche's stage looks or feels. I can't really describe his theme very well. I just like it. It's a theme unique to Avalanche thus far, and it's just a really cool bit of boss music. So instead of me talking over it, have a quick listen and judge for yourself. The only bug I know of is a visual one where he exits the background and comes to the foreground, but not quite all the way, so it looks kind of jumpy and weird. It's not that bad of a bug, all things considered. Overall, Avalanche is a pretty standard looking boss at first, but he is really quite unique in his own ways. His fight is a bit too easy and can get redundant after a few attempts, but he's still pretty unique and interesting. Number 4. Birth. I was honestly taken aback when I first met Birth. Whether it was because of his size or his combat proficiency, there's just something special and unique about Birth that you can notice as soon as you walk into his arena. He's also a boss that has a direct tie to Elboy's backstory, giving him a story justification even greater than that of Avalanche. Birth looks awesome. His color scheme looks really cool, especially in his arena, and dude, I mean, come on. He's a giant wolf beast. I love wolves and I love beasts, and I love how it all just comes together to be this awesome. Can I rate this 6 stars? Pretty please? Birth has a pretty good palette of attacks. Not only does he have a really cool counterattack move, he hits like a truck with his claw swipes and other techniques that toss you around. The only reason I couldn't give him a 5 out of 5 here is because I honestly felt like way too often he would just dart across the stage, wait a bit, then dart back, often 2 or 3 times. Chasing after a boss that is always running away and somehow still hitting you can be a huge frustration. Birth doesn't really have a gimmick, except for his counterattack, I guess. When hit with certain attacks, such as Runeslayer's Stormblade or Diabolic Esper's Maximum Strike, he'll perform a howl which negates all damage and hits nearby enemies. It's a neat mechanic, but nothing worth writing home about. Birth provides a decent challenge while you're in his level range, which is more than I can say for most bosses. It might not be the best challenge as it can be frustrating at times, but it's still pretty solid, and it got much better with the recent revamp. The stage Birth resides upon is just awesome. I love it. I just love it. The swirling portal in the background, the setting of the desecrated altar, and the background scene from so far above all just look awesome. The stage's layout is pretty simple and pretty effective for this fight. The music here is perfect for the stage. It's intense, fitting of the atmosphere of the stage, and the mood that the fight takes place under. It's a great theme, unique to Birth, and I can't think of a single reason it doesn't fit here. Birth did previously have some issues with his death animation, but the revamp took swift care of that. Aside from that minor nuisance, I haven't found any other noticeable bugs either before or after the revamp. Overall though, Birth is a great boss. Even though he resides as far back as Feta, he can still compete with the big boys and stand out as an awesome boss all the way to the end. Number 3. The Dark Nephilim. Where do I even begin with this guy? He's unique, interesting, fun to battle, and truly a titan among men when it comes to the roster of Elsword bosses. Not only do you fight him in a way unlike any other boss in the game, but he gets his own unique music, attacks, and stage that clearly define who and what he is. At one point, I considered him to be the king of kings. So, why is he not number 1? The April 29th revamp destroyed the Dark Nephilim. While it didn't touch the design, stage, or overall feel, his animation just looks plain silly now, and his hits are so much slower that he's a complete joke to fight. But let's take a closer look. The Dark Nephilim's design is awesome. Not only is he a giant without that being his defining characteristic, he's been given details from the skin of his paws to the back of his throat. The horns, scales, and skin are all colored subtly, but yet when looking at the Dark Nephilim as a whole, he stands out greatly with his colors really defining his appearance. He moves like a champion and stands intimidating before devouring his victims. While the Dark Nephilim's range of attacks are not the broadest in the game, each one is still unique and well crafted. He can do everything from claw swipes to falling energy from the sky, as well as his own personal favorite of covering the ground in energy and firing a huge laser at his helpless victims, though this attack was modified to be slightly less awesome after the revamp. Each move is unique and adds some true variety to his fight. After the revamp, however, the attacks are unnecessarily slow and don't feel as real or intense as they previously were. The battle against the Dark Nephilim has a pretty cool gimmick too. While I don't know if it's the best on this list, it's by far the most unique. The stage scrolls along as the Dark Nephilim chases you, forcing you to spring traps on him to cause him to fall, allowing you to attack him without risking loads of damage. This can get a bit repetitive, but oddly the repetition is not bothersome, and if you take too long, you eventually hit the end of the stage, forcing you to pile onto the Dark Nephilim to defeat him. I will also add that prior to this fight, it provides you with blood and mana eaters to replenish your stats before you start. That's a pretty nice touch. The Dark Nephilim was a nice challenge. We've covered his attack variety already, so let's go into a bit more detail. The upside for the challenge here is that it's a big gamble. If you get hit by the Dark Nephilim, kiss your health goodbye. Even at level 70 with grandized armor, he can take up to a quarter of my health in a single attack. However, unlike a character like Ren, whose moves are quick and take some serious technique to pick up, the Dark Nephilim takes forever to wind up. And after the recent revamp, he doesn't even do proximity damage for standing too close. You can basically idle there and avoid 90% of his attacks. This stage is obviously made specially for this boss, and it really helps to create the gimmick of the Dark Nephilim. Keep in mind that it's the stage that leads you up to the fight, the stage that holds the traps, and the stage that provides platforms and strategic ways to attack the Nephilim. It's a great, fitting stage, and honestly, if it were overdone at all, it would take away from the actual fight against the Dark Nephilim. In the end, it's just a nicely balanced stage that goes perfectly with this fight. As mentioned at the start, the Dark Nephilim gets its own unique music. Whenever I hear this music, I know I'm fighting the Dark Nephilim. It's distinct, fitting, and a darn good piece of music. Words don't do it justice. Of course, the bugs. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Nephilim, but they have to be said. Sometimes when fighting this boss, the traps don't actually spring. You hit them, but nothing happens, causing the Nephilim to just keep on walking towards you. This can sometimes break the experience of the fight, which is really the worst thing a bug can do. There's a couple graphical issues with the Nephilim, some fixed in the recent patch and some made worse, but these are lesser compared to the traps. The Dark Nephilim used to be my favorite boss fight. Reasonably challenging, fun, and really brings something truly unique to the table, which is not something you can say of every boss. Sadly, after the revamp of Velder, he gets somewhat nerfed and his animations get a bit broken. That said, he's still pretty awesome, and the Dark Nephilim is one boss that will truly stick with me as one of the greats, but I just can't justify putting him in first place the way I could before. Number 2. Karis's true form. In terms of the story, Kaeris' true form is the last boss you face. Until the arrival of Lennox is the climax of the game, more or less. The final boss of the final currently available town. This is obviously a really well-defined fight with unique mechanics and intensity up the wazoo. Kaeris' true form, which I'll just call Kaeris from now on to save 15 minutes of video time, has an awesome appearance. She's actually built into the stage and lords over you in the background, which alone is pretty awesome. In that way, she's a bit like the King Naysod. She's gone full-on demon form too, and the effect looks even cooler on her than it does on Ran. Kaeris' attacks are pretty sweet. She sends balls of darkness from the sky, much like her non-true form fight, though they seem to cover way more area. She also has an interesting technique called Death Slide, where she can pull you up into the air and hit you with chains to deal massive damage. Aside from this, her attacks are pretty standard, shooting energy balls and summoning lame enemies, which is less than incredible. The gimmick here is pretty neat. Kaeris has a core, kind of like the King Naysod, that serves as her only weak point during the fight. During specific phases, it will lower into the ground, making her invulnerable until certain tasks are achieved, like clearing the stage of tentacles. It's clear that a lot of thought went into this, and her attacks complement this gimmick well, making it very neat and easy to learn without becoming too repetitive or cheap. Kaeris, being a late game boss, is obviously very powerful and provides a good challenge. Moves like her falling energy balls or Death Slide do massive amounts of damage, which can be a nuisance, but it's a fair challenge as each one is generally dodgeable with carefully timed invincibility frames, or the proper chickening out technique. Her defense was nerfed horribly in the recent revamp, but the intensity of her summons is greatly increased, so while the fight is much shorter, it's just as challenging. I wish I could rate the stage a 5, but realistically, it doesn't thrill me that much. The inner design of it is cool, and it fits the dungeon pretty well, but it's just so boring. It's basically the same layout as that of Victor and Taranvash, and it doesn't feel like you really get a lot of maneuverability. You spend your time primarily in the center at the core, which is just a flat area. Maybe this is okay for this fight, but for me it's just not worth as much as some of the other stages. While I like the music that plays for Kaeris, it's just quite generic. Considering that the entire previous 8 towns have culminated in this climactic battle, it's really quite a letdown in terms of its music, especially considering the dungeon itself has my absolute favorite theme. Kaeris has a few bugs and weird things that can get a touch irritating. For one, sometimes her core comes up when it's supposed to be in the ground. This isn't bad if you want to win, but in terms of the fight itself, it's definitely not a good thing. Additionally, sometimes if you're launched into the air, the chains will sometimes wait too long and not hit you at all. Again, this works to your benefit, but it kind of breaks the experience. In the end, Kaeris' true form is a great boss for the end of Sander. While her attacks and summons could use some variety and interest and perhaps a bit of polish on the bug front, she still got a neat battle, which is a great way to finish off the story of Elsword. And the number 1 boss in Elsword is Ran. The last boss in a dungeon you have to repeat no less than 7 times, Ran is one of the bosses you'll likely end up fighting the most during the story of Elsword. He looks pretty benign at first until you begin to fight him, at which point it hits the fan and all hell breaks loose. Oh, and he's Ara's brother, who just happens to be a demon general that helped lead the invasion. So there's that. Ran's design is pretty neat. I mean, he's a demonic human, which basically just makes him immediately cool. His horns and demonic reddish eyes are quite cool, and his uniform is pretty slick. I couldn't justify giving him full points here though, as while he does look pretty neat, he doesn't seem to have anything unique enough to push him all the way up to 11. Ran typically seems to enjoy his swordplay, but these attacks are far from bland. They're pretty varied, and even if they don't tickle your fancy, he's got other tricks too. He'll sometimes spawn shadow versions of himself to attack the furthest enemy, and do some magical stunts like spawning gigantic claws of darkness, or reverse gravity circles. There's also my personal favorite attack that I also hate, the summoning ripples from the ground technique. It can be tough to dodge and it hits hard. Ran really doesn't have any gimmick, which is kind of his only falling point. Aside from the occasional floating away or summoning his claws from the sky, he doesn't do much out of the ordinary, leading to a pretty standard sword fight with a side helping of magic. Okay, here's where this gets embarrassing. Even at level 70, I still find Ran is challenging, more so than Waldo or the other early Sander bosses. He honestly still gives me a run for my money, and I hardly ever dare go near him without a partner. That said though, I'm rarely if ever frustrated by his battle. Despite being a demon general, he fights pretty fairly without being too predictable, so the fight itself is enjoyable. That's what I call challenging without being annoying. Ran has an awesome stage. He starts with a cutscene that shows off its background, including his own throne before he descends to the stage itself, which also looks pretty darn fancy. It resembles the main dungeon floors from the Halls of Water, but has several unique touches of its own that make it a really neat and fun stage to fight upon. The layout isn't really super fancy, but I think we can forgive that. Ran's theme is awesome, perfect for a demon general, fitting of his stage, and very climactic to symbolize the end of Hamel. I love the majestic tone of this music, and also how it strays from heroic into a desolate mix of struggles for justice against the powers of evil. It's reused for only one later boss, but I don't think that mars the beauty of this theme, simply because that other boss, who will remain unnamed, is so insignificant in comparison to Ran that this theme is clearly meant for him and only him. To top it all off, I've never discovered any real bugs with Ran, except that one time I was lagging so hard he wasn't even moving. But that wasn't Ran's fault. Poor guy. Ran is clearly one of the neatest bosses in the game and really adds to the climax of Hamel. Even though he's fought after incarnations of many other Hamel bosses, as mini-bosses, in the halls, he stands out enough on his own to make that dungeon's climax extreme. Extremely extreme! I also love the fact that he's deeply ingrained within the story, and that he continues to challenge me time after time with his variety of attacks and tricks. All in all, this is enough to land him in the #1 place among the bosses of Elsword. It's interesting to me that of the 7 bosses on this list, 5 were the final boss in their town. It makes sense, of course, that the climax of a town should be the most epic part of it, and it should really bring something new to the table. But while that's true, it also means that the creators were successful in doing so, that the bosses we face last in each town truly do leave an impact on us in the way that the other bosses never have. To be fair, I excluded some pretty good bosses from this list that probably could have made the cut. Bosses like Magmanta and Trocta are neat for their creativity, even if they have some issues or annoyances. With that said though, if you can think of some more awesome bosses, feel free to leave a like or comment down below and share who your picks are. But for now, that's all I got for you guys. So, thank you guys so much for watching. You can check out some other editorials on the left or Let's Plays on the right. Until next time guys, I'll see you later.